everyone. I'm Stephanie Boloris, your host for Forrester's podcast, What It Means, where we explore the latest market dynamics impacting executives and their customers. Today, I'm joined by Vice President and Principal Analyst Mike Gualtieri and Principal Analyst Lee Sustar to discuss the rise of the AI cloud.
Thanks for having me here today.
Thanks.
So there's a lot happening in cloud and AI right now. We could grab two big buzzwords. I don't know if buzzwords that are any bigger than cloud and AI. We can't cover all the market dynamics, but just let's level set, maybe put things into perspective. How big is this AI moment for the cloud providers?
I think it's really big. I mean, AI and cloud have obviously overlapped in the Venn diagram for some time, but now the shift has radically changed, and AI is becoming central to the value proposition of cloud, which means Mike and I's worlds have kind of converged quite a bit. So I was happy to be able to collaborate with Mike on this report.
I just wanted to add too that, like, if you think of the three workloads too of AI, which is data prep, preparing data, training a model, and then inferencing, that is using the model. Well, think about all that data, right? So there's data gravity, which exists increasingly in the cloud. So that's where, AI and cloud have overlapped. Not all of the data is in the cloud, but sometimes even the data is moved to process those workloads there as well. So yeah, I mean, there's a huge intersection here.
Does the existing value proposition of cloud apply to these AI workloads?
I would say yes, but with caveats. And Mike can talk about the caveats about when AI is appropriate for cloud and when it hits limitations. But to start with the question of data prep and training, the kind of mass media focuses on the race for the models, right? And that's obviously very important and critical and so forth. Now, as people have tried to implement these, they've had to wrestle with data and AI readiness. And our colleague Michelle Getz led a report recently about how data issues, data quality are a gate on AI adoption. So what I've been seeing over the last 2-3 months, most recently at the Google Cloud Next conference, is the cloud providers are stepping up and saying, we understand these issues. We have the data. We have been doing the analytics for some time. You've trusted us with that. And now we're going to bring that to bear in a more integrated and systematic way to what you want to do with your AI. So I would call that the creation of a kind of a Gen AI enablement platform. And let's see if they can get to operations and optimizations. But the platform elements are starting to come together in a packaged or semi-packaged way.
Yeah, and again, it's workload specific too. So, Lee was talking about the data prep and largely the training, but then there's the inferencing side. Inferencing makes a ton of sense in the cloud if it's serving an e-commerce website that's also in the cloud. But what if it's a model running in a machine in a factory or in a self-driving car? So there's also an edge approach to inferencing of the model, like actually using the model as well. And, you've seen a lot of announcements too about AI in the PC. With the PC or AI and the AI chips in the phone as well. So for the inferencing workload, which is using the model, that's sort of an edge use case as well.
Let's talk a little bit about the cloud market itself. It seems that AI came along at the perfect time for the cloud providers because, I don't know, Lee, would you say like cloud's a good 10 years old at this point? So in some sense, people who started 10 years ago with their cloud deployments, what they've deployed now is actually legacy. So they're in the process of rethinking their cloud workloads, trying to adopt more cloud native types of approaches. And then along comes AI. And in the meantime, too, I think we'd also seen that a lot of your research had kind of stated that cloud's still growing, but it's not growing as fast as it had been. So were we about to just hit a cloud workload plateau? And along comes like AI and the cloud providers are like, great, here's a chance for us to get into hyper growth again.
I agree with that observation. And essentially, if you think about what the cloud providers have had to do to catch up with the first mover, AWS, they've had to invest enormous amounts. And we know how expensive it is because Google reported that forthrightly. They would lose hundreds of millions of dollars. One time, I think $1 billion operating loss in a given quarter because they had to run around the world matching AWS rack for rack of data centers globally. And Microsoft presumably did the same thing. They don't report Azure in the same way, so we don't know, but it couldn't have been easy or cheap. So now with AI, with those much more profitable premium services further up the stack, the cloud providers can say, if I can harness my AI in my cloud infrastructure in ways that have direct relevance to power this adoption, that's a new way to recover some of those investments, as well as make it attractive, make lock in viable and something you love because it's just so differentiating and so decisive. And even if you're looking at something like a M365, kind of SaaS approach to adopting AI, the fact is behind that stands an Azure instance. So for the cloud providers, AI provides a reason for differentiating, and so it's a real challenge.
Does this point in time, this opportunity, also open an opportunity for new players? Because over the past 10 years, I mean, we've really consolidated to the three big hyperscalers, I guess four, if you consider like Alibaba and some of the others in the APAC region. So you've got 4, 5, 6 big hyperscalers, the most relevant. Is there an opportunity now for new players, or are we still talking about the same half dozen players in this market?
I think it is going to shake things up because it doesn't make any sense now to try to catch up with the hyperscalers. I mean, unless a bunch of private equity or sovereign wealth funds got together to fund someone to do that, that seems unlikely. So it makes much more sense to focus on the premium services around GPUs. So you have essentially AI clouds, and that's all they're ever going to be. They might have some core infrastructure capabilities. And I think that's where the cloud world and the industry that Mike's been following for years now and is a leading authority on are starting to interact. So I'm very curious to hear what Mike's take is on that.
Well, Lee, I mean, what immediately comes to mind is CoreWeave, Stephanie. So CoreWeave is one of those well-funded startups that's very specific. I would say it's definitely AI workloads, but probably also scientific workloads that can benefit from GPUs. So that's all they do. They just focus on that. Will we see more of those players emerge? I don't know. I think Lee's right that it's pretty hard to keep up with those hyperscalers who also have the ability to lose money to take market share.
Right. And speaking of chips, I mean, you've got some of the players who have partnered with NVIDIA, and you have some of the players actually have developed their own chips. Yeah, it's kind of fascinating, for someone who's more of a hardware background to know that the silicon matters again.
Yeah, well, I mean, Google has had their TPU, their tensor processing unit. Lee, how long have they had that?
Several years now, going back on early days of their cloud, kind of making it into enterprise class.
Right, and they just announced at Google Next their own CPU. I can't remember what it's called. I think it's called Axion.
Correct.
And AWS has Inferentia. So, and I think Microsoft's rumored to be doing some stuff as well. So, but I see that more as, they need to, this is so important to them. They need to, one, hedge their bets when it comes to sort of supplier issues. But number two, the scale at that they're working at, I'm sure they want some input into the design of those chips because they know exactly how those workloads want to be tuned. And of course, power usage, cooling, they want to optimize everything they can possibly optimize.
Yeah, it's been an interesting week. I was actually at Intel's Vision Conference this week, and they announced a number of new chips. They have their new Gaudi 3 chip as well as Xeon 6. So it'll be interesting to see how partnerships continue to play out in the chip market.
Yeah, and there's other startup chip like Cerebras, which is sort of trying to go public this year. They have a big chip. It's the size of a pizza. It's like world's biggest silicon. A graph core. So there's been some well-funded startups, but they really haven't had the traction. Certainly haven't come close to NVIDIA's dominance in all of this. But I think there's something else that enterprises have to think about here too, because it's sort of commonly thought that the models are getting bigger, there's more data, and this is just this curve is just going up, 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 up. But actually, It is in many cases for what some people call the frontier models. A frontier model is like, the best, biggest model that the open AIs do. But for enterprises, there's actually a lot of optimizations already going on. In fact, one vendor, Databricks, acquired a company called Mosaic ML, and they only focus on optimizing workloads. So, and they have data that they've published that show, okay, well, this particular model cost $450,000 to train. It's now costing $40,000 to train. So there's a lot of optimizations going on, which is very natural in anything that has to do with software as well. So there's going to be some kind of mix of workloads. It's not always a giant workload that an enterprise will need. It'll be gradation.
And for a lot of enterprises, they don't need the largest of the largest LLMs. They might actually just need something much more targeted and that's tuned specifically to their organization and a very specific task within that organization as well.
That's totally fair. And it's also that it's not one model, right? There's so many different use cases, and they're going to be handling a couple of models, a half dozen, a dozen, and probably ultimately hundreds of different specialized models, which, yes, some of those they're going to do themselves. But some of them are just going to be built into, the next version of their accounting system that they buy as well. So,
and I think this circles back to the question of new players, because the edge companies, the Fastly's, the Cloudflares, people like that have developed distinct edge development platforms already. They're experimenting with WASM, WebAssembly as a new runtime. And they are going to be in position to do some of this work themselves, where it's more appropriate for inferencing at the edge and so on. So there's a lot of technical interactions and partnerships that are probably going to evolve here. And what's interesting about the Google announcement about their ARM chip, being lower cost, because I think the cloud providers understand that the plain vanilla workloads need to run in a more cost-effective infrastructure, because the IT budget has to then be reallocated towards these more potentially differentiating AI-driven services. And that was actually the message back in November at the AWS reInvent conference as well, about being a frugal architect, because the same IT management that wants to see a much more stringent approach to budgets and so on also wants path-breaking programs around AI. So how do you have your cake and eat it too? You have to be much more focused on rationality. So what I always tell clients to do is draw a circle around your core cloud infrastructure services, where it's much easier to get a kind of apples to apples comparison with what the others are doing, and then look at some of these differentiating services and consider them separately. Maybe the infrastructure is separate and so forth, but that actually then is the pre-work needed to ascertain whether one of these new players like a CoreWeave with a kind of AI only play could fit into a mature multi-cloud environment where you've already established cloud vendor neutral governance, security, and so forth, and compliance. It's easier to assimilate a new player. Opens the door for someone like Oracle as well, which has obviously got a huge enterprise base, but is reasserting itself in cloud with data analytics, and now AI is a calling card for them. And then, of course, there's IBM with Red Hat, OpenShift, AI, and Watson X, also getting the mix from the kind of a cloud vendor neutral model.
So in terms of advantages, then I've heard a couple things, which is we've got access to these specialized and optimized chips for AI workloads. And then you've hinted at a few things, which in some cases they're wrapping services around it to make it simpler for enterprises to actually take advantage of these cloud platforms for AI.
Yeah, I mean the wrapping of the services, I'm going to call that abstracting complexity.
Yeah.
Which is what always happens in software, right? Because look, a couple of years ago, what was one of the number one challenges that rose in all of our surveys in doing AI? It was like a talent, like acquiring the right talent. And when you dig deeper on what it means to have that talent, a lot of it had to do with infrastructure. That was at least half of it, like understanding how to run these workloads and do it efficiently. So if you're a cloud provider and you can abstract that complexity, but still give someone the elasticity, the auto scaling to completely automate costs, then that really reduces your need for that type of talent on your AI projects. And when we write about this, we say you want to keep your AI teams working, not waiting for the next setup and so forth. So I think that's a big value proposition for the cloud. But there is a cost associated with that. And I've talked to many of our clients who say things like, whoa, cloud's expensive. And then you dig a little deeper because it sounds like counter to how you think about cloud as very optimized. And it's if you have workloads that are running hot, meaning round the clock type workloads. I mean, cloud is beautiful for a short workload because the elasticity, pay for what you want. But what if you want it all the time, right? So some of our larger clients who already have their own data center footprint, they try to optimize that. They try to say, all right, well, there's certain workloads we're going to continue to run ourselves. There's other workloads we'll put in the cloud. So the most sophisticated of organizations, especially if they also have HPC, high performance computing stuff. So the most sophisticated of computing enterprises probably are looking at a balance between doing it themselves and using cloud services.
Yeah, I mean, interesting enough, I would say right now, one of the most common client questions is on cloud cost management and FinOps.
Yeah.
And it's not, and this is before AI. This has been going on for the last couple of years. Yeah. So we've talked about the advantages and we've touched on the disadvantage, how expensive it can be, like when you said when those workloads run hot. We've been touching on the edge quite a bit, which is a lot of the inferencing doesn't happen in a data center or in the cloud centralized cloud environment. It's happening out at the edge. I guess also too, like we were hinting at as well, like where does the data actually live? It might live in the cloud, but it actually might live in your data center. So then if you're wanting to move to the cloud, you're having to like move the data along with it. If you're going to do the training, the tuning, and then the inferencing there as well. So that, I don't know, I keep hearing dollar signs and euro signs ringing in my head whenever I hear that.
And now AI readiness is now promoted by the cloud providers, a motivator for moving to the cloud. Well, it's going to be much more efficient if you can park your data on our infrastructure. We're going to be much more efficient. But what's interesting is the cloud providers are also, at least two of the big three, are also giving people the other route. I mean, Mike talked about things should be easier, more abstracted. We don't want to keep people waiting. But at the KubeCon conference, Microsoft announced its support for an open source project called Cato, which is essentially building out your own AI stack on Kubernetes and working in the open source world to tackle some of the limitations of Kubernetes. That's been happening for some time. There's nothing new there, but they've kind of powered a new open source project on that. And at the same time, as Google was talking about its Vertex AI managed services, they also are discussing what they're calling an AI hypercomputer. That's not a SKU that's going to show up in a console, but it's essentially a concept of using Google Kubernetes Enterprise as the foundation for an AI infrastructure, because they understand that some organizations want and need the ability to build that out. They've been doing it for some time and they want to do it at scale. They want the integrations with the new models and so forth. So that's not going to go away. So then organizations are going to have to figure out, all right, when does it make sense to press the button and get the managed service? But when does it make sense to roll up our sleeves and do it ourselves? And then that mix could be quite dynamic over time. You might start with a managed service and decide this is costing too much and we could do other things that are efficient, or we have a security and a sovereignty issue that we need to tackle. So let's build it out on one of these Kubernetes-based platforms. And so I think it's going to be a yes and.
Yeah, and I think, Lee, there's some attractive options out there that are there, but also emerging, like Red Hat, for example, right? Because that's one way to abstract your running of these workloads without. I mean, you're tied into whatever your choice is, right? Red Hat, but Red Hat can run in multiple locations. I mean, I think Oracle is like this to an extent as well, although you're kind of running Oracle services, but you can manage that their cloud even in their data centers, but also on-prem. So I think that's pretty interesting as well. And one of the things that we look at in the AI infrastructure wave is we look at where these workloads can run, right? And the cloud vendors, a few years ago, with Anthos. I mean, you don't hear much about this anymore, but Anthos and Outpost and what's Azure Arc, they were hearing from their customers. They are hearing from their customers multi-cloud or mixing the on-prem. So they came up with these software and concepts where, okay, you can run some of those workloads. And I think they're keeping that ready for when when customers actually really start demanding that if I go with you, I want to run those workloads where I want to run them, even if it's in some different cloud, specialized cloud, or my own data center.
So we've highlighted a lot of issues, advantages, disadvantages, and there's a lot of issues that enterprises have to take into consideration. Do we have specific guidance, or do we have a protocol for clients to follow as they're trying to figure this out?
Well, I'll come back to what I said earlier in that people need to differentiate between what are their core cloud services that are easier if they have a master services agreement with one cloud or another. And most big enterprises do at this point, especially in industries like financial services. Those are the more straightforward, easily compare. You're going to need network compute, storage, and managed databases and some kind of analytics program and so on. Then look at the various AI offerings and figure out what makes sense, what's worth a try, and what you think you must have now. And then put those two things together and figure out what kind of overarching discounts and packages are available. It's very easy to stumble into dependencies on any cloud. And that's fine if you want to get something done and take advantage of the rapid proliferation of services. That's fine. Just be intentional about it. And when you have a radical change in technology, such as Gen AI, it can be easy to stumble into dependencies that you don't fully understand at the outset. So yes, adopt, where it makes sense, but be judicious and don't drag along your entire infrastructure behind your AI effort if you don't need to. Maybe you do, and maybe it's worth it, but that's not a given, and it varies by organization.
And I would add that things are very unsettled in terms of AI and the approaches. We talked about workloads as if they're going to remain static. Like largely, the training workload is a static workload, meaning you run it, it produces a model, you inference. But what's coming, it's here now for some use cases, but what's going to be very prominent is reinforcement learning while that model is deployed. Right. So, you want that model to be updated. You want the telemetry from your factory or your automated vehicle to update that model right now, not collect the data and then train it later, but right now. So now you're going to have sort of an inferencing / training. You're going to have all those work variations of those workloads to incrementally update that model as well. And that can happen in the cloud. It can happen in the edge. It depends what the use case is, but that's a whole other dynamic that will occur here as well.
Do we have a sense, or would we potentially speculate about what types of companies and industries would prefer the cloud versus maybe doing it themselves on-prem? Like on the one hand, we've mentioned financial services, and they are heavily in the cloud, but they also now have the budgets and the skill sets to potentially do this themselves and not worry about the dependencies and not worry about the lock-in, and have more flexibility. And then do we see potentially more startups and mid-market companies that have less skills, like you mentioned, Mike, really needing to go to the cloud, not just for their scalability capabilities, but for all those services that you talked about being wrapped around it?
I think the industry footprint on adoption is right now is tied to size and reach of company. So a lot of the big financials are in front. They've got a lot of data. And it works the other way too. You had Google invest $1 billion in the CME Group, the big options exchange in Chicago. You had Microsoft invest in the London Stock Exchange. You have a close partnership between AWS and the NASDAQ exchange.
That's one way to get customers, right, Lee?
Yeah, exactly. So the data that they're ingesting, they want to get into that data business as well in financial services, and the cloud and those financial institutions want to harness that power as quickly as possible. I see this potentially differentiating. So that's clearly out in front. And then after that, I think a lot of retail marketing, customer service, how finely can we analyze our customer base and serve them and maximize that input. And that's where someone like a Salesforce can come in. We haven't mentioned them, but they have and had for some time their own Einstein AI platform. I think the value proposition for them is, look, we know what to do with this data. We've been doing it for a while. We'll harness our resources to the cloud providers that we run on, like AWS. We'll take care of those details, and we're going to put this at the fingertips of the people who you need it. So there's this sort of direct acquisition of AI resources to do something new, as well as the AI infusion to do what you've already been doing at a different level.
Okay. So if we were to look out, I don't know, this might be a great way to end things. What's your prediction for the future? And would you look back at any of the predictions we made in the fall and update some of those predictions in light of these trends?
Well, from our standpoint, one of the ones we made was that we think that Oracle will grab a bunch of business based on AI. And I think, people have heard of Oracle. They might not have heard of CoreWeave. And Oracle's already got their data, has expertise and a place in the big financials and these early adopters of this technology. So that's one that I think I can be pretty comfortable in saying is going to happen. And, beyond that, I think that not so much the prediction we made last fall, but the predictions about the market growth, I think it will see a bit of an acceleration. We're predicting the public cloud market will be about $1 trillion by 2026. It'll probably be somewhat north of that now based on this AI spending. So that plateau, the law of large numbers, indicates inevitably some kind of slowdown in growth, but it's going to be at a somewhat higher plateau.
And what I'd like to see emerge, and I'm not sure that the timing on this, but more of a Airbnb approach to cloud. So, if you think of the big hyperscalers as like Hilton, Marriott, these big, massive chains that have like massive hotels, and there's a need for that. But then Airbnb, where you essentially, there's different properties with their requirements. I would love to see standards emerge like that, where I could broadcast the requirements of my workload and then match that with the infrastructure. And it could be the hyperscalers, but it could be investors who decide to create a data center in New Jersey or something like that. So I would love to see a little bit more competition and flexibility and automation and where these workloads can actually run.
Yeah, I think that would be great, as opposed to just everything continuing to just be dominated by a handful of players. Because in my mind, too, I'm thinking if it's just dominated by a handful of players and they continue to offer similar types of services and they'll compete at every layer of the infrastructure. And at some point, too, like, do you also, as a company, just end up with digital sameness if you move to one of these platforms, which is you're investing in a capability, yes, that you can't necessarily build yourself, but so isn't all of your competitors as well. So where does the competitive differentiation end up coming from? But I don't know. Sometimes digital sameness is better than being left behind, I suppose.
Yeah.
All right. Well, great. Well, thank you both. I think this is a great place to end. Some great insights here. And hopefully everyone enjoyed the podcast today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
If you like what you heard today, subscribe to Forrester's What It Means podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast player. To continue the conversation, follow Forrester on LinkedIn or drop us a note at podcast@forrester.com. Thanks for listening.